How you doing?
Good.
Hey, good to see you.
You can hear me. Good.
Yeah. So here we are on Zoom, huh? Can you believe it? This is the new virtual lodge room, I guess, in some ways.
Yeah, that's for sure.
How are you hanging in there with this coronavirus and staying inside and trying not to kill family members?
Now, I've had to get out for one of my clients, but I only go down there once a week. So trying to keep them afloat, working, the rest of the employees working remotely for them. So
I see. I see. So is your business being impacted in a not negative or positive way by
no,
this?
not at all,
Oh,
actually.
wow. Okay,
Uh,
that's great.
I'm able to, the technology is such that I'm able to do most of the work from home. I own an advertising agency and I do all my TV and radio production. I had to do a quick, normally I don't do the whole soundtrack. I'll do a tag at the end maybe, but because of the social distancing, I had to do the entire soundtrack for the creative that's starting this month. So, but we're dealing with it. It's
Yeah,
working.
okay, good, good, good. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's a real pleasure to have you on this show. This is the fourth episode of a new show that I started just a little while back called Just Masons. I think you might have seen one of the episodes.
Yes,
I
I
sent
did.
you a link. Okay, so you got the idea. Basically, it's just
Right.
a casual conversation
Yeah,
with
the one
Masons.
I saw was Joe Martinez, but I'm assuming you came to me next just to upgrade the beauty.
Oh yeah, it's a huge upgrade too, right? So yeah,
Sorry,
I
Joe.
mean, no, yeah, and everyone teases Joe, but you know he's real strong. He can handle it, and he knows how to chime back real well too.
Exactly.
So, but it is a real honor to talk to you. I always like to see you, and I always feel like you're one of those Masons that likes to engage in deeper conversations about the craft and the symbology and the deeper meaning and the esoteric side. So I'm like a kid in the candy store when me and you are sitting across from a table together. We always start, immediately we go deep, straight into the light. And I appreciate that. And oftentimes you're like 10 steps ahead of me. And you know what I'm saying? So it takes me a minute to like kind of figure out, wait, what did he just say? I don't understand.
I'm probably close to 50 years ahead of you in masonry.
Yeah, that's right too. Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, that could be the deal. Yeah, that could be why this is happening, right? Um, so I don't know. So normally, what I like to do is start off the interview sort of dialogue process with some more mundane issues, and then we get a little bit more deeper. So I guess I'd like to start off by learning a little bit, just in brief, about your background, your life, and what led you to Freemasonry.
Well, it was actually an accidental happenstance. When I was just 21, I was working for the Des Moines Register newspaper, uh, selling classified advertising. And one of my clients was a realtor and an older guy. And he, every time I came in to talk to him about business, he would talk about masonry. It was sort of interesting.
Mm,
And finally, after months of this, said, it really sounds like a very interesting organization. How do I go about joining something like that? And he said, well, you just said the magic word and handed me a petition so, and explained how the process worked and all that. So
wow.
I petitioned uh, probably, I started the degrees uh, late April of 1970 and was
Jesus.
raised as a master mason in May of 1970. So they assigned me a catechism coach who lived near where I worked, and I went to his house every day after work to learn the catechism. And I was only 2 weeks between my degrees, so 2 weeks to fellowcraft, 2 weeks to master mason. So that
Wow.
went very fast. But I was very fortunate to have somebody that could work with me that frequently, and it was a really good way to instill it in you, because I was not active for many years after that. We had 2 sons. Still have them actually, but
that's good news. That's good
exactly. And while they were young, we got involved with the Boy Scouts, the Cub Scouts first, and then the Boy Scouts. And my wife was a den leader. I was a Cub master, and later on, we actually started a new Scout troop associated with the Cub Pack, because we hadn't had one meeting in the same place. So we got that started. So we were very deeply involved. When we moved out to Virginia here in '85, the boys were in middle school and high school, and we got involved in the Scouts out here. I was Scoutmaster for quite a few years out here. And then when the boys, one went off to the Navy, the other one went off to William and Mary, and I said, you know what, I'm going to get back active in Masonry. I hadn't been active in all of those years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so probably 70 to 90, yeah, close to 20 years. I was only active maybe the first few years. So it was a long dry spell. And of course, I am now in Virginia, whose ritual is significantly different than Iowa. The essence is the same, but the words are quite a bit different. And so I got into it and really got deeper and deeper into it, discovering that in order to be able to understand those first 3 degrees, you really need to experience the Royal Arch degrees. The Royal Arch degrees expand on the same material. It's all the same stuff.
Right.
They give you more detailed explanations. They give you some information that wasn't even included in those first 3 degrees, and it just, your understanding expands dramatically with that. And I tell people, they say, well, I don't need to get involved in something else. I can't go to the meetings, blah, blah, blah. You can do the degrees and not be active in the organization, and those degrees will benefit you and benefit your knowledge greatly. Absolutely.
You know, one of the things that always pops into my mind when I talk to a Mason who's been involved in Masonry for so long, I mean, I've met some older guys that were, you know, joined in like the 40s and 50s too, but you joined in 70. I was born in 71. So you became a Master Mason like a year before I was born, pretty much, which is kind of amazing to me.
Yeah.
And so one of the questions that comes into my mind immediately is like, what changes have you perceived in Masonry over these years? Like if you compare like the 70s to now, or when you first joined and now, how is it different, or how is it the same? I don't know.
It's significantly different. And the essence of that difference is in the social aspect of it. I joined when Masonry was probably at or just a little past its very peak. The lodge I joined had 600 members, but you'd come to a meeting and you might have 30 members attending a meeting out of 600.
Wow.
So it tended to be more a social kind of thing. In fact, the lodge I joined, their lodge room was huge, but they had a huge area, a lounge basically, with chairs and tables and couches. And the big thing there was playing cribbage. And the guys would come, have dinner, and then get a quick game of cribbage in before the lodge meeting started, and they'd probably play cribbage afterwards. I mean, it was a big thing. But it was obvious to me that it was a more social thing. You didn't get into deep conversations about the esoteric meanings of Masonry and how it relates to other things. So I was, being young and new, I was sort of resistant to going into Royal Arch, and I sort of regret that now, that I should have taken the Royal Arch degrees when I was new into it, and didn't realize how much that would help your understanding of those first 3 degrees.
That's right.
Now I can reflect on that and see that that was the case. But again, I think the lodge at that point was much more of a social organization than a teaching organization. And I think we are evolving now, at least certainly here in Northern Virginia, we are evolving now into what Masonry is really meant to be. And that is improving your character, your spirit,
Right.
and gaining knowledge.
Right. Right. So it's almost like a renaissance within Masonry that's occurring.
Yeah, and I'm not sure why or how that's occurring.
Yeah.
I know things started changing when Dan Brown's books came out.
Right.
That had a huge impact. And all of a sudden, here's these people seeking more knowledge and understanding, knocking on our doors. And it was like, wow.
Right. In fact, Joe Martinez says he was impacted by Dan Brown's book.
Oh, yeah. It was huge. It was huge.
So, interesting. And, when you talk about the Royal Arch, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, weren't the Royal Arch degrees, or at least the major part of the degrees, once part of the Master Mason degree, and then it got separated out?
Yeah, right? It's very interesting. I mean, you see the remnants of that in English Freemasonry. If you go to the Grand Lodge on Great Queen Street in London, there are only 2 organizations that meet. Now, they must have 40 or 50 lodge rooms. It's a massive building. They can seat thousands in their auditorium. It's an amazing building, and they're very welcome to guests coming in and looking around, and they've got a huge gift shop as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I recommend anybody going to London to stop by and see it. But there's only 2 organizations that meet there, and that's the Blue Lodge and Royal Arch. And in England, Royal Arch is strictly the Royal Arch degree, none of the other degrees. Here in Virginia, we combine Cryptic Council with Royal Arch and confer 6 degrees.
That's right.
It's a whole system. But in England, that's not the case. If you want the Mark Master degree, which is our first degree in Royal Arch, you have to go to the Grand Lodge of Mark Master Masons over on St. James's Street. And at the bottom of the street there next to St. James's Palace is the Grand Lodge of Mark Master Masons. And they've got some other appendant organizations that meet there as well. But the Operatives is one, which is a very, very interesting system of degrees.
That could be another show right there, the Operatives.
Oh yeah.
That's a very unique appendant body of sorts, right?
Actually, I have to say I probably learned more about the first 3 degrees from the Operatives, more deep information than any other thing I've done. Royal Arch is certainly the first step. Operatives gets even deeper, and you start, because it is a operative, the actual working type things, you're taught some of the same things, but in a different manner. And when you see those differences, your understanding deepens.
So it's about the nuance and the explanations that comes across in the Operatives that makes certain things click that didn't click before.
Well, it's interesting, like in Freemasonry, in our Blue Lodges, everything sort of centers around the East.
Right.
The sun rises in the East. The master represents that rising sun to set the craft to work. So your ruler presides from the East. In the Operatives, the Deputy Master Mason, who presides, sits in the West.
Right.
And he sits in the West so he can observe the rising sun and set the craft to work. Now, you can't observe the rising sun if your back is to the sun when you're sitting in the East.
That's right.
So the difference between operative and speculative, and this is where it suddenly dawned on me, the master is not observing the sun. He is the sun. He represents the sun symbolically.
Yes. Yeah, it's fascinating, because if the master's sitting in the West, he's actually receiving the light.
Well,
from the East.
If you go through the Bible,
right.
I believe it's in Kings, the completion and dedication of the temple, and it has Solomon in the west of the temple, observing the sun rising through the entrance in the east. That's between Jachin and Boaz, the 2 great pillars.
Right.
So There you go.
Yeah. The actual Temple of Solomon was with the entrance in the east.
Right.
Yeah.
And also the Essenes, they were called the Sons of Light. They had a ceremony every day. They would go out and face the east to observe and receive the rays of the sun.
Right.
That's
interesting that the Essenes were the Sons of Light. It makes me think of one, I've seen a few Rosicrucian references that the word Freemason came from Framason, which meant children of the light. I don't know the origins of that etymology, where they get that from, but it's interesting. Yeah, it is interesting. Yeah. So one more practical bit. In your case, it might be interesting, and you probably won't remember them all, but what are your titles, or what independent bodies are you part of? You know, kind of the Masonic resume, you know?
Yeah, no, I had to write up a resume for the Scottish Rite Bulletin when I was installed Venerable Master of Lodge of Perfection, which I am this current year. Not very active with it because I can't meet, but in any case, I wrote sort of the highlights, but at the very end, I said, you know, I've got other titles that I could go into, but I figure at this point you're probably already asleep, so I'll just end it here. And that's sort of the way I feel.
That's what the coffee's for.
Titles are meaningless. They really are.
Yeah.
What they represent is that you held a position and hopefully, not always, but hopefully did a job. Yeah. And the title represents the job, not the individual. And, you know, I'm past Grand High Priest of Royal Archmasons of Virginia. That and $6 will get you something to drink at Starbucks. Past illustrious Grand Master of Cryptic Masons in the District of Columbia. That's past. I did the job. I think I did it pretty well. I actually founded the first assemblage of operatives here in Virginia. Also the Masonic Order of Athelstan here in Virginia.
Never heard of that.
Yeah, and I was very active, and I hold grand title, past grand title, in the Commemorative Order of St. Thomas of Aten. These are 3 English orders that are very, very interesting and have very long histories.
So I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Well, Athelstan actually doesn't have a long history. It's just a little over 10 years old now. So that was done as sort of a honorary invitational kind of thing. So, but the interesting thing is when I took the order over, I was one of the first 22 who took the order over in England for the purpose of getting things started here in this country. And most of the guys were from Pennsylvania, but 2 of us from Virginia, myself and Joel Ratliff. He is past Grand Commander here in Virginia. He and I went over and took those orders. Well, at the end, there's this long lecture, which is very similar to the tail end of our Master Mason lecture, which is written, so there's nothing secret about it, but it's the emblems of the Master Mason degree. And that was the lecture there. It was like, man, I'm sitting there thinking, I could do this like 90 to 95% accurate. It wasn't the first time I've ever heard this. I mean, I've learned the Master Mason lecture. I give that frequently, and here it is. And so I discovered they don't have that lecture in England. So this is new stuff to them. And Thomas Smith Webb, it's right out of his primer. He's basically did these emblems as material to give as a lecture to new Master Masons. And this is new stuff to England, which is sort of interesting because they're so much older than we are.
Yeah, that's great. So I guess we could dive into the Ralph Ellis stuff, which is probably the main interesting topic of our discussion today.
Yeah, Ralph Ellis, I discovered, here's a cool thing about Freemasonry,
Mm-hmm.
is I travel a lot around the world, and you always have a friend everywhere you go.
Oh, yeah.
And I have these friends in Ireland. In fact, when I was Grand High Priest in 2015, I took 18 of us went over to Ireland and did some tours, and I had called the I can't, I think he's the Grand Tyler of the Grand Lodge of Ireland. But basically, he's the building superintendent. He sets meeting rooms up for different events and whatnot,
Mm-hmm.
and coordinates the schedule. Well, I called him, and interestingly enough, although he's Grand Tyler for the Irish Grand Lodge, he's English. But he was very helpful. And I said, look, I'd like to do some tours. Is there any Freemason in the tour business that I could have help me set this up? Because I'd just as soon give my money to a brother as to somebody I don't know.
Right.
And he said, yeah. He set me up with Ken Power. And Ken, he's in the IT business, but he has a little side business.
I think I might have met Ken.
Yeah, you probably have. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. He saw the
came
degrees.
Last year for the one-day
That's right.
control. Yeah.
Nice guy.
Yeah, Ken has a side business called Templar Tours of Ireland. He's really into Templar stuff. And there are Templar sites in Ireland, very interesting. And I told him the tours that I specifically wanted, like New Grange. And he set those things up. He had buses for us. He came with us everywhere we went. So we got to see a lot of things and meet a lot of people. And it was very interesting. Well, getting to know Ken, a friend of his, had written a very interesting book called The Secret History of the Knights Templar. And Ken got me onto his book. And because I had bought that book through Amazon, they give you tips, things that you might be interested in. And Ralph Ellis came up. And I'd never heard of Ralph Ellis before. He's an Englishman. He's also a Freemason, although that's not the central topic of his books. But the history he gives, I mean, if you've ever, the Hiram Key, for those who, Knight and Lomas, who've read that, they speculate that our Freemasonry goes back to ancient Egypt. Well, Ralph Ellis's focus is on ancient Egypt, and he came up with some, he's not a professional scholar, but he has very good techniques for doing his research. Basically, what he has done is taken the Jewish Tanakh, the Quran, the Kebra Nagast, which is the holy book of Ethiopia. Those three are religious histories, if you like.
I think he used the Talmud too, right? He often references the Talmud.
Yes, but the key, I think, was the Tanakh, which not only the Pentateuch but the commentary was pretty much the major one that he focused on. And other things come in from time to time. But those are three religious histories. He added to that the writings of Josephus, who is probably one of the historians of ancient times that was closest in time to those ancient times.
That's right.
And also Manetho, whose writings actually are not even extant any longer, but Josephus wrote extensively quoting Manetho. So through Josephus, we have a lot of Manetho's histories, and he was an Egyptian historian. So you've got a lot of stuff there, but he says, if you take these 5 books as actual histories, people say, well, you know, there's the religious spin that is put on the religious histories because of time and transcriptions. There can be errors and mistakes. But he says, look, if you take these 5, 2 of them secular, 3 of them religious, and they all agree on an event, then you can take that for fact. Because these are from different, yeah, they're from different areas. It's got to be factual. So with that in mind, his first book is Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs.
It's a beautiful cover too. I love the colorful image there.
It's pretty much an overview of his whole philosophy. There's 5 books in this series. He's written more than one series too, but 5 books in the series, and I was just so taken by this that I couldn't put them down. I went through these 5 books in no time at all. The Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, his fundamental theory is that the Jewish patriarchs, very well accounted for in the Bible, and the Quran as well, the Jewish patriarchs, he claims, were all pharaohs of Lower Egypt. That's the northern delta area in Egypt. And if you stop and think about it, places like Tanis are in the delta, and probably not even a 2-hour walk from Gaza. So that shows you the proximity there. So it's pretty easy to believe. Also, the Lower Egyptian people and the pharaohs were referred to as the Hyksos, the shepherds, the shepherd kings.
Interesting.
Very interesting, because as Ellis gets into this deeper and deeper, you discover that there arose a great conflict in Egypt between Upper and Lower Egypt. The Upper Egypt was not quite as sophisticated in as far as I can see, in science. They did have science. The priests were the possessors of science. Everything was kept secret, sort of like Masonry. And the priests in Upper Egypt were worshiping the sacred Apis bull. Apis referring to the sun, and the Apis bull is depicted as a bull's head, and between the horns is a sun disk. The people in Lower Egypt, especially at Heliopolis, the city of the sun, would observe on the vernal equinox the heliacal rising, the sunrise. The sun would come up into the position that was just moments ago occupied by the constellation Taurus in ancient times. But in the times of the rise of the Hebrews in Egypt there, they discovered it was no longer coming up in Taurus, it was coming up in Aries. Aries. The ram.
And that's the shofar.
The shepherd. The shepherd kings. The shepherd people. The sheep people. And basically, because they started venerating the sheep, the ram.
Because that was the age they were in.
Absolutely.
They understood that connection to the heavens and the earth.
They actually knew about precession and even calculated its length. But the Upper Egyptians said, but we've always done it this way. Sounds like Freemasonry again. The Lower Egyptians said, but you guys are idiots. You can see it's no longer coming up in Taurus. We should not venerate Taurus, but venerate the lamb, the sheep. And you start seeing this cropping up in so many places. Ellis's histories reveal that a civil war broke out because of that conflict, a religious conflict, a very bloody one. And so here's the essence of the division, and there were many exoduses from Egypt, as a matter of fact, mostly over religion, not always, but mostly over religion. But let's go back and look at the patriarchs. Who was the first Jew?
Is that Abraham?
There you go. I would hope you would know that.
I know, right? Yeah, I know some of the basics, you know.
not to put you on the spot, but
I know, yeah. Okay, pass the test. Thank you.
You know, okay, now here, my personal experience, and I related to this, what Ellis was writing in Jesus Last of the Pharaohs. Here's Abraham. Now, in Sunday school, I was taught that Abraham was a simple herder. He had his herd of sheep and goats.
That's right.
And an angel visited him, and he was hospitable and welcoming, and even killed a goat to feed him. And because of that, God rewarded him. Okay, let's take a look at what the Bible says. Get my notes out here. That was my experience. So Abraham was a simple shepherd.
Right.
Herder. The Bible, Genesis 13, begins with, and Abram, that was his name before changing to Abraham, was very rich in cattle, silver, and in gold. Okay. Doesn't sound like a shepherd to me.
Right.
Then in Genesis 14, there's an account of a great battle in Sodom and Gomorrah. Abram's nephew Lot, who lived in Sodom, was taken away a captive, and Abram and his 318 soldiers, he had an army with him, small, but an army with him. They defeated the retreating attackers and rescued Lot in a nighttime raid. Does this sound like a shepherd?
No, and not a simple man.
And then Melchizedek, the priest of Salem, which later became named the Jebusites lived there. They combined Jebu and Salem. Jerusalem became the name of the city where he was priest king. He was king and priest, yeah, Melchizedek. And Abram presented him a tithe of all the booty, and he gave him a blessing and gave he and his men bread and wine. Very interesting. The king of Sodom told Abram, "Give me the persons and take all the goods to thyself." So that was the agreement to end the battle. Again, this is not a poor shepherd.
Yeah,
this was a guy who came to Canaan with an army. God sent him there for a purpose. So go back and read your Bible, and the church has put spin on a lot of things, and this is one that they got completely wrong.
Right, and so Ralph Ellis is obviously a controversial researcher. He's putting some stuff out there that really goes against the grain of what people typically believe. But I like that person. I like people coming out with some new ideas, fresh concepts, fresh research, thinking outside the box, keeping an open mind.
And he's making connections with these 5 writings. He's making connections that the professional scholars have not come up with. And you wonder why.
Okay, so but how, I want to understand this sort of Jewish connection here, because he's saying a lot of the Jewish patriarchs were actually Egyptians or pharaohs or kings, I'm not sure. But they were coming from Tanis, is that right? Does he say the origin of the Jews is in Egypt somehow, or?
Well, no, not necessarily just Tanis. There are a number of cities there. Let's see here. Here was another thing. Josephus, now this is Josephus, so a secular source says, in the 10th generation after the flood, there was among the Chaldeans a man righteous and great, Abraham, and skillful in the celestial science. There you go. Interesting.
Right.
Even goes further to refer to Abram's discourse with the Egyptians, that he communicated to them arithmetic and delivered to them the science of astronomy. For before Abram came to Egypt, they were unacquainted with those parts of learning.
Right. And so the astronomy, which was then really married to astrology, they were not separate
Right.
studies, was considered the highest of those seven liberal arts.
Oh,
So someone who's
absolutely.
mastered that has gone through the ladder of the seven liberal arts and has
The
now
most
achieved the height.
sophisticated.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And it takes the greatest length of time for the observations to have meaning.
Right.
But this guy Abraham was he came from Mesopotamia,
Mm-hmm.
down on the lower part of Mesopotamia. He was obviously a priest,
Mm-hmm.
or he wouldn't have had that kind of knowledge. Very sophisticated man.
Yeah. So where did Ellis identify the Jews as the Egyptians? Are they the same people, or I
Well,
mean, how do you perceive it?
the,
That's where I get confused, because to
yeah.
me, I mean, we understand the Jews were slaves of the Egyptians from the Bible. So it's that's the part I'm trying to wrap my head around.
Well, the Jews like to think of themselves as being totally unique.
Right. Yes.
And they've tried to keep their race pure. Hasn't
Right.
worked very well, but
Yeah.
they try to keep them racially pure. But that's not how it works. Probably the Jews arose. Abraham, I mean, how many people can he father? He's supposedly the father of all the Jews. I doubt if that's actual.
Right.
If he settled in the north of Egypt and not in Canaan, he did battles in Canaan, but it's not that far away. Sodom and Gomorrah were not that far away, probably a few hours ride. If that's where they started, a great body of people grew out of there. The Jews they like to separate themselves from the Egyptians. They don't want to think of them being tainted with Egyptian blood. Yet I think that's true. Take a look at one of the characteristics you will see frequently among the Jews is the nose.
Right.
Take a look at the Egyptian pharaohs. They're all depicted with a rather prominent nose.
Right.
This is
Semitic features. Semitic features.
Yeah. I mean, it's not conclusive, but it's suggestive. It's very suggestive.
Right. Even the fact that Moses was sort of raised with Pharaoh as a sort of adopted son, and nobody really noticed.
Was he adopted son?
Yeah, was he? I don't know. What do you think?
I don't think so.
I
think his association with the Hyksos is very interesting. But he was a priest. He went through all of the learning.
Right.
He went through. He was prominent in the society there, and only the royalty and the priesthood would be privy to many of the ceremonies, and especially the secret ceremonies that went on, and certainly were the only ones privileged to the upper level of learning and knowledge. I sort of doubt that. I think the Moses and the bulrushes was a way that the Jews could adopt him as being part of theirs, because they wouldn't want to have anything to do with an Egyptian.
Right.
Right.
Well, then on the other hand, too, Jews were very adaptive as a people, and they often learned and took on the knowledge and wisdom of the peoples they were around, and incorporated that.
Absolutely.
And so being so close with the Egyptians, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I believe they did the same thing in Babylon, you know, with the Persians and the Zoroastrians.
Ellis goes on. He taught himself the Egyptian language. He taught himself the Hebrew language. I mean, that's two real biggies right there.
Oh, yeah.
And it's amazing how many words are the same or sound extremely similar in the two languages. Absolutely. So there's another connection.
There's another connection, yeah.
Now,
go ahead.
You take a look at the pharaohs had a multitude of names. Each individual pharaoh would have a number of names.
Mm-hmm.
They would have their throne name once they arose to the throne. They would have their throne name. They would have their royal or family name, birth name.
Mm-hmm.
They would have a nickname that they were called by.
Oh, wow.
These might be similar. They might be very different from each other. But it's interesting. Abraham, okay, the first Jew. There was a pharaoh, a shepherd king of Lower Egypt, whose name was Sheshi. But his common name was Me'abra, or Ibramam, or Abramam.
Wow.
So it depends on the order that the glyphs were done in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language,
Yes.
and how they were done by the scribe. Ellis even came up with where he could see there were obvious scribal errors.
Right.
Some of the characters, a reed and a feather, are very similar looking,
Right.
and they could screw up and put the wrong one in, which changes the sound, not
Yes.
necessarily majorly, but it changes the sound and how it would be pronounced.
Right, and this sort of brings me to make maybe a remark here about some of the basic assumptions that I see as underpinning Ellis's research. There was a couple assumptions, and tell me if I'm wrong, but he basically said if you can't find anything in the historical record about somebody seemingly famous and important, two things may be happening. One, the person may be listed under another name in the historical record, and you're sort of alluding to that right now.
Right.
And the second assumption is the person may have been living in a slightly different time period than we thought. So we're looking in the wrong timeline.
Right. Or
right? So it could
they
be
might live geographically different. They might be looking in the
there
wrong
you go.
place.
Yeah, thank you. That's the third one I would say. And that's really good that he's broadened, with those assumptions, because I think those are fair assumptions.
Well, the archaeologists have never found any hard evidence that Solomon or David, his father, ever existed. In fact, there's some who say they're fictitious.
Right.
These are made up. Ellis says they're looking in the wrong place. They need to go down to the Nile Delta.
Mm-hmm.
Ellis claims he's discovered the tombs or burials. There's nothing standing at Tanis any longer, but in Tanis, the ruins of Tanis, you could see the outlines of family burials. And he claims he's discovered where David and Solomon are buried in a family burial.
And what's cool about some of his research, I mean, is that he's actually able to identify who these people really were. And sometimes you even find busts or sculptures or images of these famous people throughout history that he's claiming we have now an image of them.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if he did that with Solomon. I don't remember if he has a bust of King Solomon or what he would have looked like.
It's interesting, too, that going back to the Abramam, the Pharaoh Sheshi is one of his other names. His son, the son of Sheshi, was Anather, who he claims was Isaac. And his son was the Pharaoh Jacob. Or Jacoba.
Right. Well, that's Jacob.
And that was his Pharaonic name, was Jacoba.
Wow.
So and he was one who was involved in one of the great exoduses, and this came at a time when the Santorini, the island of Santorini in the Greek islands, erupted. And he claims that you can explain every one of the plagues of Egypt from the after effects of the eruption of Santorini.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
And with this fight going on between North and South, the Upper Egyptians saying, Taurus, we've always worshiped Taurus. Now we got to start changing, and no, we're not going to do that. And the Lower Egyptians saying, you idiots,
Yeah.
plebeians, get with the science here. And
Yeah.
so this grew into a great battle. Well, when this eruption started and these plagues all hit, the plague of boils, yeah, this is ash, hot ash falling out of the air and burning people.
Wow.
It kills the fish. The frogs come in
Mhm.
to clean up the mess, and the flies. So all these plagues basically can be explained by the after effects of what
Right.
happened with
So,
Santorini eruption.
so what you mentioned, the lower Egyptians, were sort of ahead of the curve and trying to convince the upper Egyptians that, we needed to be focused on Aries, and now that the procession has moved into Aries out of Taurus. So, a lot of people get this thing backwards in their minds, the upper, lower Egypt. And
Right.
Right. And so lower Egypt is actually the one at the top,
Right.
in the north, right?
Right.
Of
That's
Egypt.
north, yeah.
Yeah. So
Because it's at sea level.
got it.
It
Just
is
wanted
low.
to clarify that.
So you
Yeah,
go
exactly.
you
'Cause
go
it's-
higher as you go south, yeah.
Right, because it's lower down on the flow of the Nile
Yeah, right.
as it reaches its outlets
Exactly, yeah.
in the north. Got it. The other thing I thought was interesting, I mean, there were a lot of interesting points. I mean, I reviewed some of Ellis's work before our talk, so I can actually have an intelligent discussion with you. And this whole idea of the Garden of Aten and Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Did you read a little bit about that? I thought that was really compelling too.
Well, he said this first Exodus was actually a fight between Jacob and his brother Esau, who was Pharaoh in Upper Egypt. And it was the religious battle, but it was also very personal, going back to things that happened regarding birthright and all that sort of thing.
Right.
So anyway, it was very bloody. It was very bad. And the city of Aries was a stronghold where Jacoba, it was a defendable city with walls. And that's where they ended up. And Ellis speculates that this idea of the Passover and putting the blood of the lamb, the shepherd people, the blood of the lamb on the doorpost to identify them as people of the sheep. We're not people of the bull, we're people of the sheep. And that way the soldiers, as they were going around and literally raping, pillaging, burning, stealing everything that wasn't nailed down, would leave the good people alone. And this got so bad that when Esau came down to Aries, he saw the great greed that they were stealing everything and killing people. He's basically, that's where the word avarice comes from. That this would be ever remembered for this great greed or avarice. So
fascinating. And I'm thinking of another link to the whole shepherd idea and the shepherd's people, and Egypt in particular. Brother Richard Casaro, who's written some really good books on the triptych. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's a really good researcher also. And one of his claims is that the mummies and the sarcophagus of a lot of these pharaohs are made in the image of Isis. And Isis has like a shepherd's crook and flail, and has long hair and a beard. And so he identifies this as where this whole Jesus idea of the shepherd comes from, with the long hair and a beard. So again, we're coming back to this constant theme of the shepherd coming through in Egypt.
And it's interesting that Ellis says because of the Jewish revulsion over being identified with the Egyptians, actually put a spin on the story in the Bible of the and created a myth of the slaughter of the holy innocents. There was the order from Herod to kill all of the male children under 2 years of age.
Right.
And he says that's a myth, because you don't see that reported anywhere else. And where else you kill 2,000 infants, that's going to show up somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's just hard to believe that that wouldn't be recorded somewhere else other than the Bible. So this is a cover story because the Holy Family went to Egypt. Why did they go to Egypt? It was because they were fleeing so he wouldn't be killed. No, it was because Jesus was being trained at Heliopolis to become a pharaoh,
Wow.
to be a king.
Right.
Hey, king. He was called king.
Messiah, the anointed one.
Well, Messiah, and that's a misunderstood.
Right.
All it means is the anointed one. Well,
Mhm.
how do you choose a king? You anoint him.
Right.
How do you choose a priest? You anoint him.
Right. Right.
So, and there are many, many cases of priest kings, not just Melchizedek. So.
Right. And so I want to talk about Jesus also, but I'm not sure if I should talk about the Garden of Aten and Akhenaten and Nefertiti
Well,
first.
before we leave the
Yeah.
Jesus going to Egypt thing,
Okay, go ahead.
what happened to all his teen years? That's not recorded
Jesus.
anywhere.
Right, the lost years, right?
Well, intentionally lost probably because he was at Heliopolis learning to be Pharaoh.
Yeah, I mean, there's also records
that
there's also some records in, I think, Tibet that Isa, which I think is another pronunciation of Jesus,
right.
Was in Tibet. So I mean, there's all kinds of interesting history about Jesus and his sort of travels and studies.
Well, and in Hebrew there is no J, it's Yeshua.
Yes, exactly. So Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Ralph Ellis is claiming that, I'm not sure if they came from the Garden of Aten, and he's saying that the Garden of Aten is actually the Garden of Eden. Aten, exactly. Eden, the same thing. Yeah. And he's saying that Akhenaten and Nefertiti are the Adam and Eve figures, which I thought, wow, that's interesting. And then he goes on to this whole thing about why Akhenaten and Nefertiti look so strange. Akhenaten in particular, as a man, has such female features with the wide hips and this protruding belly, and he's just very odd looking man. Some people think he has a DNA problem, some kind of genetic disorder, but he's saying that he was part of a belief system or a cult of some kind that practiced castration to become a hermaphrodite for spiritual reasons and become sort of like the primordial Adam Kadmon, who had both male and female qualities and was thus more godlike.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've gone down that track with him, because he's got a lot of different lines of research.
They've never found Akhenaten's body.
Uh-huh.
And Ellis speculates there was a second Exodus. The first Exodus, the biggie, was with Jacoba, the Hyksos pharaoh of Lower Egypt, Jacob. So that was the first big Exodus. Mm-hmm. And that was bloody and nasty. This whole thing about the Egyptians being swallowed up by the sea. Well, in the delta there, he claims that they were escaping Aries, getting out of town, and that Jacob, and this is recorded in the Bible too, that Jacob actually with his commandos sneaked into the Pharaoh's camp at night and pulled all of the locking pins from the chariots that keep the wheels on.
Right. Well,
and the next day, when they tried to chase them, they were going through a forded area in the Nile Delta. As they were wading through that, the Pharaoh's army discovers they're escaping and comes down on them with all their chariots, which the minute they hit the mud and water, the wheels fall off and the chariots sink down into the water. So there's the being swallowed up.
Interesting.
Yeah. Makes sense. But the second Exodus, which was much later in time, he says was actually Akhenaten. And he claims that Akhenaten had a brother whose name was Tutmosis.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now, could Akhenaten, the priest, the king, could Akhenaten possibly be Aaron,
Hmm.
and his
Sim-
brother Moses.
right. Akhenaten, Aaron. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
They never found the body of Akhenaten.
Hmm.
They found his son's body, but not Akhenaten.
Right. Yeah. No, I've heard that theory too, and yeah, it's compelling. You know. Um,
Again, you're looking in the wrong place.
Right, and that's the crux of a lot of his research is he's saying we're all looking in the wrong place. That's why we're
Yeah.
not finding anything.
Right.
He also talks about Jesus being a Nazarene.
Or a Nazarite is another
Another way
pronunciation.
of putting it. Yeah, yeah. A lot of people say he was from Nazareth, but Ellis says Nazareth is a new town and it wasn't there then.
Right,
It was
right.
the Nazarenes. It was a sect of Jews that Jesus was part of.
They were a very extreme organization.
Extreme, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and he said they also practiced castration. I think Ellis even goes so far as I was listening to one talk, a panel discussion at ARC, the Alternative Research Center, I think it's called.
Right.
And he was saying that someone asked Ellis a question, do you think Jesus was castrated or that he castrated himself? And if so, how, if he had children? And so he believes both, actually. Ellis said he believes he had children before he was castrated, but he does believe Jesus was castrated. He was, agreed to be castrated as part of this sort of religious system he was part of, which was very austere.
Yeah.
So that's, a bit of a controversial view, but he's got a lot of views on a lot of things. He's done a broad amount of research.
He does a lot of speculation, but he
Right.
generally identifies the speculation and tries
Yes.
to verify the facts from
Right.
these 5 sources and other even archaeological evidence. So.
Right. He also talks about Flavius Josephus or Josephus
Yes.
being the same person as Saul or Saint Paul,
Right.
and really the founder of Christianity. He talks about the Jews at the time wanting to maybe create a message for the Gentiles that he calls simple Judaism.
Right.
And that's where Christianity came from.
Look at how modern Christianity resembles the pagan religions that were extant at the time that Christianity grew up.
Yeah.
So to make it acceptable to the Gentiles, to the pagans, you had to usurp some of those things. Like Mithra.
Right.
Mithra was born on December 25th. He died and was put into a subterranean tomb and arose after 3 days. That happened in the spring. So too many. Oh, and Mithra was born of a virgin. Okay.
Right.
Well, you invent these myths to make Christianity more acceptable, because I think the original Christians, the followers of Jesus, the Essenes, the Nazarites, would be very much offended by that.
Yes, indeed. I think maybe the last little piece maybe I'd like to talk about with you around Ralph Ellis is this idea that I don't know if the Romans deported Jesus to England and where he became sort of the King Arthur with the 12 Knights of the Round Table. Reminds me of the 12 Apostles. Do you know much about that? What's Ralph Ellis believe? How did Jesus end up in England and get associated with King Arthur?
Well, I don't know that Jesus actually did.
Okay.
I would, if he lived and survived and left the Holy Land, it probably would have been somewhere in southern France, and there's traditions.
Right, I've heard that.
Go with that, yeah.
That's right.
Cathars and all that, but Glastonbury is supposedly where the Knights Templar took the Holy Grail, the blood of Jesus. Well, was this blood caught in a cup that's the Grail, or is it the Holy Grail, San Graal, could be Sang Real, the royal blood, Sang Real. And if that's the case, that blood could be flowing in his descendants.
Interesting.
So it would be not a cup, but it would be the
Right.
descendants. So
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about this idea of the Holy Grail. The Grail is symbolic of a device for receiving
right,
something, right? So you could see it as like a womb or a female concept, and then you'd pour the red or the fire from heaven into that cup. So it's almost like the joining of heaven and earth. The earth would be the reception of the Grail, and then the heaven would be the symbolic of the wine coming down, and this could also be akin to the sort of Kabbalistic idea of the Shekinah, our divine spark, which might be feminine, right? Or the Sophia, or the whore of Babylon, the divine prostitute, the soul that's come through this world of materiality, that's actually very pure, but has to come through this very physical and not so clean experience, or it feels that way sometimes. Yeah. And this is a very Gnostic idea, but
actually, it sounds dualist to me. But
it's very dualist. It's very dualist. It's true, but I mean, this idea that the sort of the keepers of the Grail, or the people of the Grail and the royal bloodline, maybe real royalty is the people who are spiritual, people who are actually spiritual. And maybe that's what really a Jew means, to be a Jew. It's not something that's maybe so genetically inherited, although there may be that aspect to this kind of thing that, depending on your family, if your family was very spiritual, you might have a chance of being more spiritual yourself. But I think, for me personally, I think of Jews as someone who has a connection with the divine,
right,
and has that better understanding. So I see Jew as a broader sense to me, and yeah.
Well, Ellis has identified too the similarities between the Jewish sacrificial worship and the Egyptians had the same things. Their altars were very, very similar in nature. The priests' garb was very, very similar.
Yeah.
There's a lot of similarity between the two religions as they were practiced. So.
Absolutely. So, well, Brother Don McAndrews, this has been fantastic. Do you have any final words you want to share with the audience? Any words of wisdom?
Again, I just, if you're interested in following up on this, Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs by Ralph Ellis, you can get it, the hard copies from Amazon. You can get it on what do you call it? The downloads, the virtual books.
That's right.
Yeah, so you get it either way, and there's an interesting book that I'm working on right now because of the connections with Ireland. I met the guy who's the secretary of the Irish Grand Lodge, irishfreemasonry.com. Very interesting. They had a book. In fact, here it is.
Crafting the Cross.
This author lives up in the north of Ireland. He did a book on Saint Columba, who's second only to Saint Patrick in veneration. He was one of the early converters to Christianity. But Chris McClintock, the author, he claims that Columba was the last of the Druids. Very interesting. And he's discovered there's a St. Columba. He lived up in Glen Colum Kill. Kill means church.
Right.
Glen, obviously, people know what a glen is. And Colum is the name for Columba in Gaelic. So the glen of the Church of Columba. And there are astronomical observatory points there that involve the Celtic crosses and a hillside where they could actually gauge
fascinating.
The season. So
fascinating.
Very interesting. And I was supposed to be in Ireland right now, and Chris was going to put me up for a couple nights at his house, take me over to County Donegal where all of these things are to be seen, and be able to take some pictures. But I highly recommend his book, Crafting the Cross.
Okay.
And you can get the Columba book as well, but you have to go to irishfreemasonry.com. He's a self-publisher, so it's only available through the Research Lodge in Ireland.
Right.
you can, they do a PayPal thing or whatever, so you don't even have to worry about the exchange rate. So
it was interesting. Last night I was in a presentation by Brother Adam Goldman on the occult symbols of Freemasonry, and he made a connection that maybe I hadn't previously paid attention to or noticed around this column idea, Columbia, column, and column, and the columns and the pillars, the two pillars, and the word column in general and column are related. And the idea that the secrets of Freemasonry or the seven liberal arts and sciences were hidden in these columns.
Well, in this area too, Chris has identified that this is the only place, there's a band that goes around the earth, but that's the only place where the solstices will cast shadows at right angles.
Interesting.
A square.
There you go.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So, and on the final note, I think you're doing a presentation soon with Brother Kevin Homan on Ralph Ellis, and you're going to do a formal presentation on some of the stuff we informally discussed.
Actually, I did a paper on Ralph Ellis's work, and I'll probably just read and present that, because I had done this for the Esotericon last year, and a number of people were not able to see that. And,
I see. Okay.
So this is our way of preserving that for those who might be interested.
And so when is that going to happen?
I think Kevin? It's Tuesday next week.
Tuesday, like Tuesday evening or 8 or 9 or something.
Yeah, I think he does it late in the evening.
Yeah, it should. I think it should be advertised on Refracted Light Facebook group page. Under the events, you'll be able to find that. Folks will be able to see that. All right, brother. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you're a recurring guest on my show.
Well, we ought to come back and talk about the operatives, because I think that
I believe that would be really interesting. Exactly. All right, brother. Thanks so much. Have a great day.
You bet. You too.
Cheers.